Good morning.
Good morning.
So, as Ken said, we've known each other for a couple of years, and so I think you describe yourself as a co-conspirator of Ken's, and I feel the same way in various ways. I've been always impressed by the work Ken's doing in the healthcare space, but also more generally, and so have been happy to try to lend a hand. My understanding of where you all are is that you are all loosely moving in the same policy direction, and that you are all, in that regard, kind of co-conspirators trying to transform this country's healthcare system so that it is universal in one fashion or another. There may be different disagreements amongst you about exactly what that means. That it's fair, as per the heading here, that it's for all, and that's really the key thing. So my goal is to try to convince you that moving in the same policy direction isn't sufficient. That actually having a shared sense of the values lying behind the policy direction that you're pursuing will be critical to the success of the policy direction. Now, I want to clarify what I mean by that up front, because you might hear me say, you need sort of shared values behind the policy direction and think that I mean everybody must believe exactly the same set of things. And that's not the case at all. I think having a set of shared value commitments that serve as a kind of North Star for the work of democracy is a complicated thing and permits all kinds of room for a variety of different perspectives about why something matters. And so the story I'm going to try to tell you this morning is about that issue of how we link up the diversity and full range of our personal value commitments to some element of shared set of values around which we can coordinate and coalesce and build alliances, form solidarity, and extend the reach of our call for support on behalf of universal healthcare, healthcare for all, or making healthcare fair. To try to convince you that values sometimes come before policy, that cultural change is upstream from policy change, as Ken has put on the poster here. I'm actually going to take you through a little bit of a wander in democratic theory, what philosophers call democratic theory, and a little bit of wander through some of the ideas from the American founding. As I wander through the American founding, I'll also say something about what it means to reach back to that past, which in this country, many of us have very different relationships to that past and to our understanding of its values. I'm going to want to spend some time talking about that as well. But let me just start with the democratic theory point. It's a very simple point, but one that we don't pay enough attention to is the fact that democracies are more intellectually demanding of their citizens than other forms of government. What does that mean? Imagine trying to explain to a kid what a monarchy is. It's not that hard. You find a picture of a king, you say, that person makes the rules. End of story. You don't have to say much more beyond that for a child to understand what the concept of monarchy is. Now try to imagine explaining, and I'm sure you all have at various points in your lives, tried to explain democracy to kids, right? Okay, so democracy, okay, no picture. I can't really point to anything about what this democracy is. I ask the question, who's in charge? Oh, the people? Democracy literally means rule by the people? Well, who is this people? Where are they? What on earth can that possibly mean? One gets to things like Congress, and then you have to try to explain representation, and how do people over here make rules that somehow I have some kind of authorship right over? It's very abstract. And this feature of democracy sets it apart from any other political form. So to participate in a democracy from the beginning is to participate in a world of philosophy, even implicitly, even if that never comes to the level of consciousness. Now, this has a further significant point in that what makes the people that can, in some sense, own a democracy, is never anything other than an understanding of what that people is about. Something shared, some ideal that makes it worthwhile to try to do things together. And again, that sounds very simple, but if you don't have that, the people can't function together. And then the democracy doesn't have anything that can hold it together ultimately. You might have sort of institutions that continue to operate, but you don't have the thing underneath it that was the point of democracy in the first place. So democracies around the world and over time have generally depended on a cluster of value terms and then have organized them somewhat differently. There's typically liberty in the mix, or freedom. There's typically equality in the mix of some sort. In the modern era, there's often been opportunity, justice. So there's a kind of cluster of terms that you actually need at a rudimentary level to make sense of what a democracy is. And a democracy is basically people who agree that these value terms should help them guide their decision making, that they have a North Star, shared North Star. Now, that makes it all sound extremely simple, and then of course we have massive fights over what any of these words actually means. And I want to give you just one example of one fight that I think is a little clarifying about the stakes of values and why they matter as one prepares to enter into policy. And that's the fight that we have over the concept of freedom. So I've spent a lot of time tracking how values language operates in our politics, both in the present and in the past. And a very striking thing about our current partisan landscape is actually starting to change finally, but it's taken a long time. But from the middle of the 20th century up through about 2010, it's fair to say that the language of Republican candidates was just full of the vocabulary of freedom consistently. And the language of Democratic candidates was full of the vocabulary of justice and or equality. What are those others? But neither tended to use the vocabulary of the other. My favorite example is sort of Paul Ryan at one point where this was during the 26 campaign, and he was sort of ticking off the values of democracy. He said freedom, liberty, and then another version of freedom. He had like 4 different ways of saying freedom, and he never once mentioned equality, even though he was sort of ticking off different values of democracy. And the same thing is true on the other side. So how has this happened that there's this pattern? This is where I want to come to sort of the fight we have over the concept of freedom. Freedom can have multiple definitions, and depending on how you define it, you get very different kinds of policies flowing from it. So the most commonly kind of competing conceptions of freedom are something that philosophers call freedom from interference on the one hand, and another concept called freedom from domination. Right? So freedom from interference is a concept that really emerges in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it takes the view that any kind of law whatsoever interferes with basic human freedom. And therefore, law itself, government itself, is to be resisted because it erodes human freedom. And that should be a kind of recognizable formulation, and sort of has played out on the right for many, many decades. But there's a countervailing argument, which is that, no, it's not the case that any law, by definition, is a violation of freedom. Laws are a violation of freedom only if they dominate. That is, if they are arbitrary in some fashion or leave people at the mercy of arbitrary control of others. So any human society needs laws in order to organize itself. The argument runs along these lines. And so the question is always, are the laws that are just and fair, or are they laws that dominate? What we want is freedom from anything that dominates, from laws that dominate or other structures of human social organizations that dominate. And when you think about freedom as freedom from domination, then suddenly the question is not how do we minimize law. The question is how do we ensure that all of our laws are protecting people from experiences of domination. And you get a very different set of policies that way. Now, just take the healthcare example. It's sort of pretty straightforward how that plays out. If you understand freedom as freedom from interference, why? You just don't think the government should get involved in healthcare. And that's one line, one position in our national discourse. If on the other hand, you think that freedom is freedom from domination, and you see that people are trapped by the fragmentation of our healthcare system, they can't move from one job to the next because they can't afford to give up their healthcare, or they get stuck without healthcare, and in the absence of being able to secure a basic, sort of decent state for themselves physically, they're not able to pursue opportunity. So it's another version of domination. So our system, as it currently works, does subject people to domination. So freedom from domination would be achieving a healthcare system that gets people out of all those traps. Right? So 2 different definitions of freedom give you 2 very different kind of policy approaches. So over the last generation, the right has been fighting on the concept of freedom, the left has been fighting on the concept of equality. And in that regard, the left has ceded a lot of ground by giving up the concept of freedom. And it's not necessary, because there's a perfectly good, philosophically sound conception of freedom that should be core to our understanding of what this democratic republic is and what is the basis for human flourishing. Okay, so that was a bit of a journey through the abstract elements of thinking about democracy. For the sake of simply pointing out, the abstractions matter, the value terms matter, and different policy frameworks are hung on different value terms. When people broadly in the public are talking and thinking about policy, they don't tend to dive into the nitty-gritty of any particular policy arrangement. They really want to know, what direction will this policy take me? And the value terms answer the question of what direction the policy is going to take them. Okay? Is it going to take me to freedom? People like, we all love freedom, we just do. So is it going to take me to freedom? Okay, well, now do I understand what kind of freedom I'm talking about? Is it going to take me to equality, to opportunity, etc.? Those are the questions that people have first. So I'm articulating this view about the role of value terms in helping form consensus to support policy, but I'm not by any stretch of the imagination the first person to articulate this view. So we've seen a very recent example in the way the marriage equality movement has played out, and the very fact that I use the phrase marriage equality already tells you a story about how cultural change preceded policy change. The gay rights movement re-described itself as a marriage equality movement, quite self-consciously. And the reason it did was because it wanted to tap into the common American understanding of equality, freedom in the choice of the relationship, freedom to love whom I want to love, all those core American ideas. Wanted to take their movement and re-describe it in these terms in order to build broad consensus for it. And that succeeded. And there's lots of good evidence to show that that effort, that change in how they thought about the values structuring their movements, it wasn't about sort of special group of rights for one group over here. It was about a group of people who've been excluded from a shared set of rights, having access to those shared set of rights. That change did have a big impact on public opinion, and the changes in public opinion preceded the changes in law and the changes in the Supreme Court and so forth. All right, so that's a sort of recent example of a group who've understood this view. But of course, the oldest example in our country of a group who've understood the view I'm articulating is the founding generation. I always say founding generation, I don't say founding fathers, because the founding generation included women as well as men, right? Just that's a little editorial note, okay? But just keep it in mind, because you can say founding generation, and it puts you in a different position for talking about the American founding, and I can talk about some of the women involved if that's of interest. At any rate, the founding generation definitely understood this argument about the relationship between values, forming communities of consensus, and policy change. And I always, Ken knows, has heard me do this a million times, revert back to the Declaration of Independence and its incredibly pithy summary of the work of civic agency to make this point. So, if you want just a little manual for how to do democratic politics, you can get it in one extremely long sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. You did not remember it was that long, did you? Because everybody stops on the pursuit of happiness. That's a mistake. I can explain how it is we've come to make that mistake. But I'm going to repeat the sentence once more. I want you to listen to the whole thing. And I want you to try to register what happens when you stop at pursuit of happiness, okay? If you don't hear the whole thing. And I'm going to have we're going to take a break to do a quiz and see what you notice, okay? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle, and organizing its power in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and and happiness. So what happens if you keep listening past pursuit of happiness? What did you notice?
There's a role of government in order to achieve that. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. When you stop at pursuit of happiness, it's just individual rights. The whole sentence is an argument. It's what philosophers call syllogism. People have rights. You institute government to secure those rights. And if government's not doing its job, you gotta change it. Yes, Jessica.
I was just going to say consent of the government. But the government requires the consent of the government. Government's needs are no longer being met.
That's right. Exactly. That the government securing the rights rests on the consent of the people, and the consent of the people rests on this conversation about the principles, laying the foundation on principle, and connecting that to how you're going to organize the powers of government. Yeah.
It comes back to your original point about the responsibility of citizens.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I was going. So consider the government is one thing. In fact, people have to create the government.
That's right. Exactly. It's our instrument. It's our tool for delivering security for our rights. Now, what about that list of rights? Did you all notice what's happening there? It's a
It's an incomplete list.
Yes, exactly. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a set of examples. It's not supposed to be a complete list. It's an invitation to continued thought about what belongs on that list. So, okay, among these is healthcare, perhaps? Right? A question worth asking? A question worth asking? But the most important thing is that it's an invitation to continued thought for every generation to revisit the question of what are the basic rights that we believe is necessary to secure to affect our safety and happiness. And that's the other beautiful thing the sentence does, is make that transit from my life, liberty, and happiness to, at the end of it, our safety and happiness, right? So whatever the people think is most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, another little detail of this sentence that I love, which is this is a deeply buried detail, I don't know if this one will be so helpful to you, but the phrase safety and happiness is basically an 18th century translation of the Latin phrase salus populi, the well-being or health of the people. Salus means health. All physicians will know that. And that was, in Rome, Republican Rome, Cicero argued that the salus, health or well-being of the people, is the supreme law. At the end of the day, everything comes down to that. And that's what the phrase safety and happiness is also expressing. Right? It's that salus populi idea. And again, that's an idea about health and well-being of the people. That's what the Declaration is aimed at. That's what the preamble of the Constitution is aimed at when it comes back around and saying we're trying to improve our effort to deliver the welfare of the people. It's that big concept of the health and well-being of the people. So, all right, so the founding generation understood that the people needed to take responsibility for organizing an instrument of government, and that taking that responsibility required figuring out the foundation of principle. That's the point about the discussion about values. And they genuinely did that work of doing the values discussion before they decided on the policies. So for example, in 1775 and 1776, the prelude to revolution, they had a lot of debates about what their guiding principles should be. And they were considering breaking off from England, but they didn't want to actually break off from England until they had gotten to clarity about their guiding principles. And we can see that in a couple of ways. The first is just the number of pamphlets they had debating what they were after. Were they after justice? Were they after happiness? Were they after rights of property? One of the biggest debates was it the happiness term or the property term that they were going to put at the center of what they were doing? And as they were debating this question about what their purposes were, the whys of their action, they also began to debate how to organize the powers of government. So they actually started writing state constitutions before they revolted from England. This is something people don't know. So it's not that you first revolt and then you build something. They actually started the building process first, and then they decided to revolt. And the building process had two phases, values and then figuring out the organizational structure of government. And what the values work meant was that when they decided to declare independence, they wanted a unanimous vote. None of this kind of Brexit mistake where they thought a majority vote would be sufficient for a change of that magnitude. They wanted unanimity, all right? And so that was the point of the values work, was to really make sure everybody was on the same page. So they did have, so Richard Henry Lee proposed in independence in June 5th, in Continental Congress, and they did not have unanimity then, but they wanted to have it by July. So what they decided at that point to do was to go ahead and set up 3 committees to prepare for the moment of the final vote. One committee would articulate the foundation of principle. That was the committee that Thomas Jefferson ended up as chair of. All right? That's what resulted in the Declaration of Independence. They set up another committee to write the Articles of Confederation, and a third committee to set up the treaties with France and Spain. So the point is that they were explicit about the values work, the values statement, and then the policy statements coming alongside each other, all right? So that then when they got to July, they were ready to vote on the values statement. It took them another 6 years to vote on the policy statement, okay? So that's the sense in which these things were sequential as well. But they were able to vote unanimously on the values statement and the immediate policy of revolution from England. Now, the degree to which they took this seriously, that there were these 2 parts of the work, foundation of principle and organizing powers of government, values and policy, came out again in the Constitutional Convention when they actually paused in the middle of the convention to ask the question of whether or not they needed to rewrite the value statement, foundation of principle, or just rewrite the document organizing the powers of government. They actually deliberated on that question. They decided they did not need a new value statement. What they did need was a new document to organize the powers of government. But they maintained self-consciousness about that double-pronged work consistently, and their ability to build sufficient consensus to achieve radical change came from that focus. Okay? Because they all knew where they were going, same direction. At the same time that was the case, when they signed on to these documents unanimously, in the case of the Declaration, and then with a 2/3 majority ratifying states in the case of the Constitution, they also did have different reasons for signing on. So they experienced what philosophers call an overlapping consensus. In other words, we have this myth about originalism, that there was a single thing that the founding generation believed or subscribed to, and that's just not the case. So they had different underlying reasons for grabbing onto these shared values. The most extreme version of this, and one we don't want to repeat, is the difference of point of view they had around slavery, for example. Okay? But another way of capturing that is in the Declaration. The language around religion is extremely subtle and complicated. There's not a single word for God in the Declaration that connotes a specific religion, for starters. And then there's also language in the Declaration that makes it kind of belt and suspenders document. So the principles are grounded on the law of nature and nature's God. So people who don't want to think about things in theistic terms can grab hold of the law of nature language. And then the people who do want to grab hold of things in theistic terms can grab hold of the nature's God language. So they found ways of formulating a commitment and direction that permitted people to grab on despite having differences of underlying fundamental metaphysical perspective. Right? So there's the lesson from the founding. We actually saw that lesson at work, I would say, in the gay rights and marriage equality movement. And so I'm encouraging you to consider this lesson of putting values beneath the work of policy change, of recognizing that cultural change is upstream from policy change at the heart of the work that you're doing on healthcare as well. So let me just say 2 last things about the founding, what it means to talk about the founding, especially coming from the left side of our political house. Because the founding has not been a topic embraced by the left for the obvious reasons of its failures. Slavery, genocide of Native Americans, the list goes on, patriarchal system of power. So those things are all features of the founding without any question. But the fact that our country has split into a half that focuses on those features and a half that focuses on the positive features of the founding. And this has had dire consequences. And I'm going to just give you one concrete example that for me is a motivation for all of us to learn how to reclaim our past and find a path to some shared account of it. So kids don't get civics education anymore. I don't know how much you're aware of that, but time on civics in schools has massively declined. There are several reasons for that, but one of them is that when the National Governors Association was working on the Common Core and building up the Common Core state standards in education, they wanted standards in English language arts, in STEM, and in social studies. They achieved standards in English language arts and STEM. And the result of achieving standards is that you test, and then teachers teach the test, and anything that's not tested doesn't get time in school, right? So they did not achieve standards in social studies. That's been a big driver of the decline in time on civics and social studies in school. Why not? Because they couldn't agree about what version of the past our students should learn, okay? Because the conversation split between the focus on slavery, the focus on genocide of Native Americans, the focus on patriarchy, the focus on the great achievements of the past. So because we adults are so divided in our own sense of talking about the past, our kids aren't getting to learn history and civics. Okay? Just a complete direct consequence of our polarization. So, this is lamentable. You go back to the beginning of my remarks when I said democracy demands more intellectually of citizens than other forms. Democracy actually demands that we understand things like the separation of powers and how representation works and what it takes to weave a culture out of a multicultural community where some have experienced domination historically. All of these bodies of knowledge are things we need to help our democracy be healthy and function. So if we're to have that knowledge, if we're to be able to function together, we actually need to figure out how to build a shared narrative of our history. So what I always argue for these days is the sort of question of creativity. How can we find a path towards invocations of our past that are appreciative of the real and solid lessons of the founding without deifying the founders, that are honest about the failures and crimes of the founding without tipping into cynicism. So I think those are the guideposts we need. Appreciative without deifying, honest without cynicism. And I believe that in that space, in between those guardrails, there ought to be ways for people on the left who are committed to equality and justice to invoke the story of the founding, to dig into its lessons about freedom, to understand how its lessons about freedom support, in fact, the things that the Democratic Party advocates for, not just the things the Republican Party perhaps advocates for, and to make use of our tradition in order to communicate as broadly as possible, connect with as many Americans as possible in making the case for things like making healthcare fair or healthcare for all. So let me stop there. I've put a lot on the table for us to talk about. I hope, again, at the end of the day, that my single most emphatic message is to encourage you to follow the advice of the Declaration and to consider the foundation of principle on which you're laying your healthcare work as you also think about the policy tools through which you would organize the powers of government. It's that two-pronged job that permits building that consent of the people, that consensus that can support really significant change in the society.